Richard Sonn, professor of history at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He teaches courses in modern French history and social, cultural, and intellectual history. He is the author of 3 previous books, all of which focus on anarchism during the Third Republic. This paper is part of his current book project, Time is a River Without Banks, Immigrant Jewish Artists in Paris, 1900 to 1945. Richard Sonn. Thank you.
After losing disastrously to the Prussians in 1870-71, then finding their country surpassed economically and demographically by the new German Reich, the French were beset by a pervasive fear of decadence that has become synonymous with the term fin de siècle. The sense of decline was abetted by economic depression, which lasted on and off until 1896, by political crises such as the Panama Scandal, which included some prominent Jewish bankers, and by a wave of anarchist bombings that culminated in the assassination of the President of France in 1894. Army Captain Alfred Dreyfus pursued a military career, as if to underscore that all roads were open to Jews in Republican France. But instead of being welcomed as a patriot, he was accused of treason. The Dreyfus Affair divided France at the end of the 19th century and revealed large reservoirs of anti-Semitism in the Republic. Anti-Semites perceived Dreyfus as lacking vitality and courage, as being weak and nervous. If serving on the French general staff did not suffice to prove a Jewish man's virility, what hope was there for less martial Jews? The interwar journalist and novelist Joseph Roth oversimplified the story of Jewish emigration when he suggested that most such emigrants had received their call-up papers and decided to leave Russia or Austria rather than serve in the military. Nevertheless, it was an oft-told story that Jewish men faced a grim fate if they served in these Eastern armies, and many did leave to avoid military service. Roth wrote in the 1930s, quote, "If Eastern Jews weren't quite so timorous, they could take justifiable pride in being the most anti-militaristic people in the world," end quote. Roth explained further that serving the Tsar or Emperor meant bearing arms on the Jewish Sabbath, breaking kosher dietary laws, and facing anti-Semitic hostility. Eastern Jewish tradition celebrated the scholar and rabbi as male models of behavior and rectitude rather than the warrior image of the knight, held up as an exemplar for mainstream European masculinity. Jewish men who were not cerebral were mercantile, yet neither rabbis nor merchants conformed to martial ideals. Rabbinic tradition held up the mild and studious Jacob as the model man rather than his aggressive and wild brother Esau. Jewish male roles, whether scholarly, mercantile, or professional, rarely expressed physicality. None of these professions would have helped young Jewish artists express their masculinity. The nearest equivalent to an artist would have been a cafe intellectual or writer. The working with brush or chisel was more tactile and artisanal than creating with a pen. Art remained a largely male sphere, as female artists such as Marevna Vorobyev ruefully acknowledged, and female artists such as and French artists such as the sculptor Auguste Rodin projected a hypermasculine image. Mainstream artists such as Rodin, who received commissions from the state, were distant from bohemian artists existing in poverty on the fringe of society. Young Jews must have found the roles to be even more tenuous, given how little place was accorded to artists in Ashkenazi society, although Sephardic Jews such as Pasquin and Modigliani had less to prove. Assimilation into French society and assumptions about standards of manliness help explain the war-era behavior of two immigrant Jewish artists, Moise Kisling and Leopold Gottlieb. Historians of gender roles have shown how Jews were stigmatized, arguing that Jewish men were grouped with homosexuals in the 19th century as marginalized outsiders and countertypes, who helped mainstream European society construct its own image. The anti-Semitic, self-hating Austrian Jew Otto Weininger represented the apex of this attitude. He connected hatred of Jews and women in his influential 1903 book, Sex and Character. Weininger was unable to enjoy the notoriety of his racist and misogynist creed since he killed himself a few months after his book came out. Reinforcing the argument that diasporic Jews failed as men, the nascent Zionist movement in the 1890s argued that only by reclaiming the land of Israel and working the land could effete coffeehouse Jews turn into muscle Jews. Max Nordau, second in command to the Zionist leader Theodor Herzl, was especially eager to promote a tough new Jewish manliness. Even before he became a Zionist stalwart, he was famous for his 1892, or infamous possibly, for his 1892 book, Degeneration, which equated most modern art and literature with madness and degeneracy. His subsequent embrace of Zionism as Jewish nationalism, the political corollary of his critique of Western society, bore some similarity to right-wing nationalists who sought regeneration through politics. The early Zionists sponsored Jewish sports societies to overcome their alleged nervousness. Taking a different tack, Sigmund Freud would locate Jewish male uncertainty and ambivalence in a castration complex fostered by the traditional practice of circumcision, which he identified as, quote, the deepest unconscious root of anti-Semitism, end quote. One does not have to accept Freudian psychology to see in the era of pogroms Jewish masculinity was as threatened as were hopes of assimilation. The founder of Zionism himself advocated the strictest traditions of chivalric honor for his westernized beau ideal. In Dreyfus-era Paris in the 1890s, Theodor Herzl had the opportunity to see many Jews defending the honor of their race. Particularly vulnerable and eager to defend their honor were the hundreds of Jewish members of the French officer corps. The most tragic duel was fought by Captain Armand Meyer and the Marquis de Maurès. Maurès ran Meyer through with his sword in 1892, before the Dreyfus Affair, but in response to a rising tide of anti-Semitism fostered by Edouard Drumont's anti-Semitic paper, La Libre Parole. Drumont's claim that Jewish officers' promotions were due to bribery and connections led to a series of duels. In 1912, for example, as shown here, the future socialist leader Leon Blum fought a duel with the playwright Pierre Weber, and only missed killing Weber because his sword struck the playwright in the sternum. In accepting to fight such duels, anti-Semites who denied that Jews could be true Frenchmen were conveying a de facto message of equality on the field of honor. Maurice Kisling arrived in Paris from Poland, aged 19, in 1910, where he moved into the Bateau Lavoir around the time that Picasso was leaving, but soon followed Picasso to Montparnasse. Kisling was a colorful character with an exuberant personality. His most famous exploit before the war involved not art, but the duel he fought on June 12, 1914, with fellow Polish Jewish artist Leopold Gottlieb, quote, on an unspecified question of honor. A woman is often suspected of being at stake. Gottlieb's good friend Diego Rivera acted as his second. They began with pistols and finished with sabers. The duel ended after an hour of combat when Kisling wounded Gottlieb on the chin. He in turn managed to slash Kisling across the nose. Kisling evidently was not injured seriously since he was able to quip that his flayed nose marked the fourth partition of Poland. He and his friends went out to drink to celebrate his survival as well as his panache. The duel is well documented photographically, as you can see, including close-ups of Kisling's sliced nose, suggesting that the escapade may have been as much a publicity event as a serious conflict. Since both duelists would soon be fighting in the war, albeit on opposite sides, their duels suggest that they took the masculine cult of honor and violence as seriously as had Leon Blum 2 years earlier. A duel fought at dawn made its immigrant participants appear as true Frenchmen. The Bohemian British expat artist Nina Hamnet reported that the duel was shown on that evening's newsreels. So even though this duel had nothing to do with defending the honor of Jews and was a purely private affair, it was deemed newsworthy. At the outbreak of war, Kisling was visiting the Low Countries, but he returned to France and enlisted in the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the French Foreign Legion. Gottlieb returned to Poland in 1914 and served with Pilsudski's Polish Legion, which meant that he was fighting with an independent unit of the Austro-Hungarian army. Why would a young art student volunteer to fight and possibly die for a country he barely knew? One might not expect the bohemian milieu of Montparnasse to encourage strong nationalist feelings, especially among artists who lived alongside many other foreigners, were still learning the French language, and might feel more comfortable speaking Yiddish, Russian, or Polish. Aside from gratitude for the nation that had opened its doors to them, enemy aliens had to choose between leaving France and serving in its army. Since Kisling came from Krakow, he was a citizen of the Habsburg Empire. He fought in the Foreign Legion alongside Louis Marcoussis and Simon Monzan, also Polish Jews, but from the Russian sector, and with the Swiss poet Blaise Cendrars. Osip Zadkine served in a non-combatant capacity as a stretcher bearer. Cendrars was not Jewish, but knew many of the artists of La Ruche between 1911 and 1914, in particular Chagall and Modigliani. Despite being a foreigner, a leftist, and an arch-bohemian, Cendrars took it upon himself to issue a call for intellectuals and foreigners to support the war. The poet and promoter of Cubism, Guillaume Apollinaire, signed this call to arms and soon volunteered as well. Of the 17 signatories, 12 were Russian or Romanian-born Jews. Cendrars joined the Legion on September 3rd and headed for the front, where he had the misfortune of losing an arm, but gained naturalized French citizenship the following year. Kisling and Zadkine were also wounded in action, became French citizens, and remained in France the rest of their lives, with the exception of the next war, and they fled to America. Monzan, too, survived the war, became a French citizen, married a Jewish woman from Algiers, and settled there in the 1930s, later splitting his time between Algiers and Paris until the end of French Algeria in 1962. Maurice Kisling and Simon Monzan were friends and fellow art students in Krakow, Poland. They studied under Joseph Pankowitz, who had spent his own formative years in Paris, and encouraged many of his students to do the same. Kisling fought alongside Blaise Cendrars and was wounded at Carency in 1915. He was found buried in the earth, his chest caved in. He returned to Paris, where doctors feared he might contract tuberculosis, and advised him to go south to recuperate in a warmer climate. Kisling headed for Spain, but was back in Paris in 1916, where he then collaborated with Cendrars on a small book called La Guerre au Luxembourg. Kisling contributed 6 drawings to illustrate Cendrars' book-length poem, set not on the Western Front, but in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. Cendrars described children playing at war with kites rising as rapidly as fighter planes. Kisling's illustrations are as charming and innocent as Cendrars' text. This book by 2 wounded warriors was as far from the experience of the front as it was possible to get, which Cendrars recorded later in his memoir, La Main Coupée. It is hard to say whether this was due to wartime censorship, strict in embattled France, or simply to the fact that both veterans were recuperating back in Paris and recorded what they experienced as convalescence. The book was dedicated to fallen comrades, including Mislaw Kohn, presumably another Polish Jew, and Victor Chapman, an American who died at Verdun on June 23, 1916, the first U.S. aviator to die in the war. Chapman and Kisling must have been good friends, for the aviator left the still unknown artist the significant sum of $5,000 in his will. Maurice Kisling became a French citizen in 1924, by which time he was a successful artist with a large studio in Montparnasse. Sonn received his wound in September 1915, at which time the Legion lost 608 men out of 1,960. His lost arm did not dampen Sonn enthusiasm for carousing with Modigliani on his return to Montparnasse. Modi painted his portrait in 1918. Kisling's friend Simon Monzan, who was 3 years older and arrived in Paris in 1909, was one of the rare soldiers who went through the war unscathed. On September 10, 1916, Kisling wrote to Monzan that he was thrilled to hear that his friend was alive. That same year, Monzan, still at the front, did a powerful drawing that he later turned into a painting called Pro Patria. It shows a nude Marianne holding a bouquet of flowers toward a soldier in a casket, both in a reinforced trench. This undoubtedly remained a private sketch, since the French government forbade the publication of any images that show wounded or dead French soldiers. Monzan received his naturalization papers as a French citizen in 1923. Jacques Lipschitz, who did not volunteer to fight and who married a fellow Russian immigrant, received his French naturalization the same year as Kisling in 1924. In his case, remaining in Montparnasse and advancing his artistic career served him well. Leopold Gottlieb also became deeply involved in the war after serving a lengthy artistic apprenticeship in Paris. Born in 1879, and so like his friend and compatriot Bella Mutter, somewhat older than most of his peers, Gottlieb had lived in Paris since 1908. And like her, he specialized in portraiture and did a portrait of Mutter's husband, in addition to likenesses of the critic André Salon, Diego Rivera, and Jules Pasquin. Also like Mutter, Gottlieb was inspired by visits to Spain and by the art of El Greco, and like her too, painted scenes of poverty and marginalization. Unlike the Warsaw-born Mutter, Gottlieb was a citizen of Austria-Hungary, whose Jewish citizens felt much more loyalty and even gratitude to their tolerant Emperor Franz Joseph than did Russian Jews to the regime of Nicholas II. In 1914, after fighting his duel with Kisling, Gottlieb returned home to join the Polish Legion, a formation created by the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and led by Józef Pilsudski. Pilsudski was a nationalist who saw his Polish Legion as a nucleus of a future Polish nation. Pilsudski did in fact become the father of a renewed Polish Republic after the war. Furthermore, Pilsudski envisioned a multi-ethnic Poland, an important issue given that Poland was 10% Jewish. 3 million Jews still live there despite considerable emigration in the previous decades. Gottlieb drew many portraits of Pilsudski, often in action on horseback, as well as his fellow Polish combatants, and these went on display in Krakow during the war. According to Gottlieb's biographer Artur Tanikowski, the drawings were published in a portfolio called The Legions in Zurich, Switzerland in 1916. He rendered these drawings in a realist style, with none of the sometimes dreamy quality that infused his paintings. Pilsudski is easily recognizable from his large black mustache and stern features, looking every inch the commander. Gottlieb showed his fellow soldiers at play as well as at war, some holding machine guns, but others with musical instruments. Mandolins and accordions. Publishing a book of wartime drawings in 1916 should have placed Gottlieb at the forefront of wartime artists, except that he was involved in a mostly unknown sector of the war. Motivated by Polish nationalism, Leopold Gottlieb became the most significant Jewish artist to represent life at the front in the First World War. This does not mean, however, that Gottlieb was the most significant Jewish artist working during the war. Back in Paris, the artists who remained in their studios in Montparnasse were crucial to the continuation of the pre-war avant-garde. Diego Rivera and Jacques Lipchitz, good friends who traveled together in Spain in 1914, experimented with Cubist techniques in painting and sculpture at a time when Cubists, such as Georges Braque, were at the front, and Pablo Picasso, back in Paris, was moving toward realism and classicism. Rivera's lover, Marevna Vorobyev, a painter who bore Rivera a daughter immediately after the war, did at least one painting that combined Cubist technique with a wartime theme. Robert and Sonia Delaunay fled France in 1914 and spent the war years in Spain and Portugal. Sonia, of Russian Jewish origin, continued her exploration of the Delaunay's mutual simultaneist style with Market and Minho. Amedeo Modigliani did nearly all of the paintings for which he is remembered in his Montparnasse studio during the war, including many portraits of his fellow Jewish artists. As these few examples show, the war did not greatly affect their art, nor their commitment to modernism. Gottlieb would eventually return to Paris in 1925 and spend the last 9 years of his life there. Toward the end, with the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, Jewish themes returned to his work, and his paintings became allegorical. Leopold Gottlieb's life and career, aside from the usual military involvement that made him effectively an enemy combatant, though the Polish Legion fought the Russians rather than the French army, shows an artist moving freely between East and West, Poland and Paris, trying on a variety of styles from realist to modernist, if not avant-garde. By contrast, his opponent and fellow Polish Jew Kisling had no interest in returning to the land of his birth, and instead played a central role in interwar Montparnasse society. As if to highlight that fact, he married a non-Jewish French woman in 1917, who was also the daughter of the commander of the Republican Guard, an elite Parisian cavalry unit that paraded in bright helmets with plumes. This unlikely match would probably not have happened without Kisling having served France at the front. When he was awarded the Legion of Honor in 1933, much of artistic Montparnasse celebrated with him at La Coupole. Kisling's reputation also guaranteed him a place among the exiles who made it to the United States during World War II, along with Manet Katz, Chagall, Lipchitz, and Zadkine. Despite possessing more modest artistic abilities than his French Jewish artists in exile, Kisling was a mainstay of the École de Paris, due in part to his sparkling personality, but also to his decision to stay and fight for France in 1914. Thank you.